Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumile Matezi. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, email your thoughts about this program and many other programs and many other topics to Rights and Recourse at sabc.co.za. Looking back over 2 decades of democracy and to challenges ahead, South African Vice-Chancellors identified 6 key issues they consider critical to higher education's future health: student access and success, research and postgraduate education, transformation, securing the next generation of academics, institutional diversity and funding growth. But they also represented opportunities to create a more vibrant, equitable, responsive and high-quality system that could contribute more effectively to the fourfold South African challenge of environmentally sustainable economic development with increasing social equity and social justice and the consolidation and deepening of democracy. Today on Rights and Recourse, we explore the proposals contained in the Higher Education Amendment Bill that is presently before Parliament and its responses to these challenges. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Professor Chris de Beer, Vice-Chancellor of the Sefako Makgatho Health Sciences University. And at our Cape Town studios, we would like to welcome Professor John Higgins from the Department of English at the University of Cape Town. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Professor de Beer, let me start with you. When the department was presenting this bill before Parliament on the 27th of January this year, if I remember correctly, Dr. Diane Parker traced the process back to 2012 and said it had controversial amendments then. What is controversial about it, and what does this bill seek to achieve?
Dumile, I think the issue was that some of the stakeholders felt that 2011 as well as the 2012 amendments to the Act were not properly consulted in the first instance, and they may in practice pose a real threat to institutional autonomy. That, I think, is what she was alluding to.
There's other things from the challenges we have spoken about in our opening stanza. We spoke about issues that were identified by Vice-Chancellors over the years. I came across those issues too. I'm not too sure we'll explore whether the bill does address those things.
Yes. Apart from addressing the issue that I've just alluded to, the 2012 amendments, the bill also tries to address some of the transformational matters which were identified by the Vice-Chancellors. And you will also find in the bill some aspects pertaining to differentiation within the system. I think that's the 2 issues that this particular bill is playing into with reference to the Vice-Chancellor's identified goals. But the bill is, of course, about much more than that. And I think there are about 6 matters that one could raise with regard to the bill. The first one is that the bill is intended to improve the system based on the collective experience of implementing the Higher Education Act since 1997. That's the first thing that the bill, I think, is bringing to the table. The second thing is that the bill also provides essential legislative platforms with a view to giving effect to and to align the provision of higher education with government priorities. I think that's an important aspect. Then, of course, it tries also to rectify what was legislated in 2012 to bring a much better balance between institutional autonomy and public accountability. And with that, also the discussion with regard to academic freedom. That's also on the side of that particular matter.
Let's leave it there. Academic freedom. Professor Higgins, you actually in your book, Academic Freedom, you actually touched on what is essentially in the bill. I think you looked at the old part of the bill that was said to be controversial. Can you point out to the issues that you pointed out in your book as to what is it that you found controversial in the book?
Okay, what I found, higher education is an absolutely crucial part of a transforming and democratic society. Therefore, the bill, is very important. In the original version, what disturbed a number of people was the centralization of decision-making and authority for higher education into the state through the hand of the minister and away from the universities. With the amendments to the bill, some of that has been rectified, but what we're seeing is a replay of centuries-old disputes about the place of the university in society. Should it be an instrument of the state, or should it be something that stands at some distance from the state serving the public good? And with that, there are two different kinds of definitions of the role of the university and the importance of academic freedom. I feared at the time that we were veering towards too much state control.
Let's take an answer to that question you asked. What is the role of a university? Probably we should start there, Professor De Beer.
Yes, Dubila, I think, one should not take out of the discussion the fact that we're talking about public universities, meaning that these universities
belong to the
are
state,
sponsored, mainly, some of them completely, others to a lesser extent, are sponsored by the government of the day with taxpayers' money. So apart from the institutional autonomy and the academic freedom, which we all recognize, you have to look at the flip side of the coin, which is the public accountability. And when you talk about public universities, the public accountability must be there, and one has to try to balance institutional autonomy and public accountability. I think there was some distortions with regard to that. And by the way, this principle was already accepted in the 1997 Act. And if you look at the preamble to the Act and the goals that they've articulated in the particular Act at the time, it is referring to this particular matter of academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and public accountability. And one cannot hide, as a university or an institution, especially a public institution, behind the issue of institutional autonomy and not recognize the implications and the importance of public accountability.
The other question I want to go to, if these amendments quickly were drafted in 2012 with tweaking towards this present day, did the Fees Must Fall campaign and the Roads Must Fall campaign take the department and the institutions by surprise?
I think the Vice-Chancellors are on record by saying that we, long before the Fees Must Fall campaign commenced, that we are heading for a perfect storm, meaning that the way in which universities are being funded and is inadequate, and that is actually putting the universities up with a challenge where they have to recover the lack of income that they experience because of the public funding model, that they have to recover those funds.
We'll continue with this vein, Professor, as soon as we come back from a break. Unfortunately, we have to go to the break. If you want to join us in this discussion, you can phone us on 011-714-5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Recourse, or email your thoughts to recourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
The big news is Newsroom.
We also stream live on YouTube.
Whether you're at home, at the office or at the gym, wherever you are, Newsroom is right there with you. Bringing you all the latest news, updates, sports, weather and everything in between. Get all the latest news you need on the go via live streaming on our YouTube channel. That's Newsroom, weekdays at 9 a.m. only on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the Higher Education Amendment Bill with Professor De Beer here with me in the studio and Professor John Higgins down in Cape Town. Professor, you were still explaining, giving us a little bit of explanation around this issue.
Yes, I was just talking to the funding of universities. And the current funding model provides for universities to ask tuition and accommodation fees from students with a view to balancing their budgets and to provide for their operating expenses. And the fact that the funding model was not adjusted in time and in accordance with our own context, the universities had to more and more rely on tuition fees to balance their budgets. And I think that was the response, that it was that sort of incremental increase of tuition fees that led to the disquiet in the system from the student organizations and others.
Can we quickly touch on some of the issues around, now that you speak about the budget? Professor Higgins, we have seen huge infrastructural problems in some institutions. We've seen what happened in Cape Town during the week with the building of a shack outside the residence. If government is the owner of the institutions, as we heard earlier, why has accommodation for students not been provided for over the years?
Well, it's one of the central contradictions, I think, that we're faced with. And I think it's very important to say one thing here as a prelude, which is that public accountability goes actually two ways. On the one hand, there's the need for the universities to provide very good quality higher education. On the other hand, there's a need for the state to fund higher education sufficiently to enable that to happen. Now, what we've seen in the past 20 years is virtually a doubling of student numbers, but not an increase in financial support at all levels in terms of staffing, in terms of accommodation, in terms of the space on campuses for teaching. So the system is under severe strain, as you can imagine. If you double the numbers, but you cut down on staff, you maintain the same size of classroom, you maintain the same accommodation, although accommodation has been growing. All of that needs funding. So on the issue of public accountability, the state has not been held to account enough to provide the proper funding to enable transformation at universities. And this, I think, is one of the things, but not exclusively, which is at the core of student protest. They're admitted into university, they're not funded enough, there's not enough accommodation, there's not enough staff, there's not enough funding to support the increased and necessarily increased number of students.
Let's take, Professor De Beer, let's take your university. Your university has been around for some time. It was known as Medunsa before. And surely when the new name and new direction was plotted by the department, surely some of these things with reference to infrastructure have been looked at, should have been looked at.
Yes. No, Dumile, I think there was a clear plan when this particular university was established, as it was with the two other new universities that were established.
The Mpumalanga University,
the Solplaatje University in Kimberley and Mpumalanga in Nelspruit. And with the establishment arrangements, there was a clear plan to also provide the infrastructure that is required to grow this university to the numbers that were anticipated. Unfortunately, we have the current financial situation in the country, and I think the department was forced to cut back on the original planning. But as we speak, there are major infrastructure developments taking place at the Saltpleike University in Kimberley. It's actually a huge structures that they are building there, as well as at the Mpumalanga University in Nelspruit. As far as my university is concerned, we haven't started with the infrastructure development as was envisaged, but we hope to get some good messages from the department with regard to what should happen. But the problem is, if we could just return to accommodation for a moment, I think there was a distinction made between the more advantaged universities and the historically disadvantaged universities. Advantaged universities seldom got contributions from the department with a view to building accommodation. It was expected from those institutions to build these accommodation facilities from their own funds. The other group of universities were more favorably treated, correctly so, because they do not have the reserve funds that you would find elsewhere, and they got some substantive support with regard to the increase in the capacity of accommodation. It's not at the level that we would like this to happen, and I think new initiatives we will have to explore some new options.
Professor, probably both of you can come in here with regard to the previously disadvantaged universities, where the two I can think of, the University of Venda, University of Ongoye down in Natal, and Fort Hare University. Somebody said to me, I had a discussion, so we're watching the celebrations at Fort Hare, the centenary celebrations. Somebody said to me, it's a indictment that the University of Fort Hare is in a state it is, and it has such an illustrious history of the people they had produced. I think the oldest who's leaving today is President Robert Mugabe. And people say nothing has been done at this university. It's a laughing shame. Professor Higgins?
Well, I think some things are being done at Fort Hare. There are some very exciting initiatives that are taking place there. So it would be not entirely right to say that. But I think, what we're recognizing is that we still haven't faced the problem of the apartheid division of the university system into, historically black universities and historically white universities. That problem hasn't been faced. And I think the amendment bill also isn't really facing that, in particular in relation to the new nomenclature it proposes for looking at the higher education system.
Do you want to comment on that, Professor? I think off the air we did speak about Fort Hare.
Yes. No, I think Professor Higgins is correct to say that this is one of those legacies of a previous dispensation that we haven't been able to attend to appropriately. Most of the historically disadvantaged institutions, there are exceptions, are in a bad state from an infrastructure perspective. Not only with regard to the maintenance of the existing infrastructure. In some instances, it is so bad that you will have to demolish some of the infrastructure. And the upgrade of the infrastructure, the upgrading of that is hugely problematic, and we would need substantial amounts of money to make sure that we not only preserve what we have at these institutions, but that we bring it up to the point where it would meet the minimum standards, especially if you look at accommodation. The department published minimum standards that would apply with regard to accommodation. And just to meet that, is a huge challenge for some of our institutions.
I looked at the paper this morning. I saw a graphic illustration of how some of these universities are, that kids are sleeping one next to the other, and one kid was telling a journalist that she's sleeping in the lab in order for her to be able to at least to get to school the next day, because her parents haven't sent her money to pay for accommodation.
Yeah. Just to respond to that, I understand why students are up in arms with regard to accommodation. Some of them really live in conditions that one would not want to describe in public. And we need some serious interventions, but it would require major infrastructure allocations to these institutions. It's not only, and I have to say this, it's not only preserving the current facilities, but it's also about dealing with the backlogs. At my institution, I would need about 2,000 residence places immediately on the campus. And I'm saying this in all the responsibility that I carry. That's the seriousness of the issue.
The issues for me, really, I looked at the bill, whether the bill responds to these kind of things. Does the bill respond to this issue so that we can close this issue of accommodation, residences?
Yes, I think the bill was never intended to deal with the funding of universities specifically.
In other words, I was right when I said the bill was put together in 2012. And when the Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall campaign came into being, the bill was already there. So they didn't bring these things back into the bill.
Yes, I think one should ask the question whether it's apposite to have arrangements around the financing of universities in the Higher Education Act. I think that's the critical point for me. I don't think it is the place to deal with that. What Professor Higgins actually said was more relevant to what the Act is trying to achieve. And that is, that pertains to differentiation in the system, and how do we prepare the legislative framework for new developments as envisaged in the post-school white paper.
Professor Higgins, I seem to hear Professor De Beer here saying there should be another legislative process put in place that deals specifically with funding for universities, especially with regard to infrastructure and other things, like libraries and labs and those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's clearly a matter of considerable urgency that the issue of funding at all levels and in every dimension of higher education is seriously looked at now. I mean, it's, what was it, 2005 that we had the Ramaphosa Committee looking at the funding of higher education and pointing out the underfunding that was been going on for 10 years or so. That has now reached an absolutely critical point. So there needs to be, and I'm sure there is likely to be already, some real thinking going on into the desperate need for improved funding in every dimension: accommodation, infrastructure, funding for staff, research monies, teaching. Everything needs to be addressed.
Professor, let me come back to something else. Taking all of these things into account, I think Professor Higgins made reference to a committee that was established in 2005 to look into these things, funding for universities. Does the bill take into account the provisions of the National Development Plan?
Yes. Dumile, indeed, I alluded to it earlier on, that since the Act was drafted and approved in 1997, the higher education, the Act itself was amended about 9 times in between 1997 and 2012. But since the Act was promulgated, the higher education scenario actually changed dramatically. And in the National Development Plan, you would find, certain outcomes to be achieved by, I think, 2025 or 2030, with regard to participation, with regard to how the post-school system would be populated and access of students to the post-school system, the articulation of students within the system, the recognition of prior learning and all of those things. The bill attempts to deal with some of those issues that were not only mentioned in the NDP but also in the post-school education and training white paper, which was approved. In particular, and I think this needs to be understood clearly, in particular, the issue of transformation. If you look at the white paper, it is clear from the white paper that the institutions did not respond adequately to the call to transform the system and to fundamentally transform the system. You know, transformation is not only about black and white in terms of students and staff. It's about much more than that. And there was not an adequate response to the call to transform the system, and the time has now arrived to take that not only up as a priority, but also to give it some legislative teeth, as it were.
Let's come to that, Professor. We'll continue with this vein on transformation when we come back. And let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll like you to join us in today's discussion. Please call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rise Recourse. Stay with us.
SABC News. We report, contextualize and present news and current affairs honestly, fairly and fully. We consider it a duty to provide consistent, relevant, useful and top quality information and analysis. Our mission is to provide credible, accurate and interesting news programming, bringing news into everyone's homes in everyone's languages. Thank you, South Africa, for relying on SABC News for quality news output and for making us your #1 source of information. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the Higher Education Amendment Bill with all the trappings around it. Professor, both of you, I think Professor De Beer, you have already started talking about transformation, and you gave it this broad definition, which I like because it involves a whole lot of things. Professor John Higgins, what are your I had a fight with one of your colleagues here one day around issues of transformation at your university. And I said to him, I don't understand, why are you complaining about transformation at your university when you had 2 black vice-chancellors over the last 20 years? Why didn't they not transform this organization, this institution?
Well, I think whenever transformation comes up as an idea, it's so big. You know, people have difficulty in focusing on the discrete bits of it. One thing I think we should remember is the time frame for transformation. And I'm put in mind of how the Chinese responded when asked about, was the French Revolution a success? And they said it was much too early to say. The profound transformation that South Africa needs is not something that can be achieved in a short time frame. It's a historical project.
In other words, are you saying it's something that needs to evolve?
Generation.
Are you saying it's something that needs to evolve?
Yes. So let's look at it this way. In one dimension, transformation has evidently been, pretty successful. The number of black students entering and attending universities has increased dramatically. So on that level, it's a visible success. What people often talk about and complain about is, of course, at the level of the black professoriate, that rate of change isn't the same. But, and they say it's too slow. But to determine whether it's too slow, you first of all need to understand what is the rate of change and development at the professorial level. And what, researchers generally say is that you need to be appointed as an academic, you need to work for 10 or 15 years before you're likely to become a professor. Now, we've had 20 years since apartheid formally ended. That's given some time for a lot of new students to come into the system, but hardly time for them to grow into professors as yet. So it's a process that takes time. And I think we have to really think carefully about that question of time and developing the resources of the country in that way. But it's evidently started. So that's one dimension.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the lack of black professors, and I've asked a question here to somewhere amongst this milieu of questions that we have seen this great number of black students coming into higher education institutions, a huge number of them. But what happens on the other side when they get out? What do we do about the passes, the failures, what happens? The other area for me that is of concern is the lack of postgraduate blacks going on to do postgraduate studies. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And I think the so-called in-gap program that the DHET started is exactly designed to assist the universities to have more young academics, black academics and female academics entering the fray. And I think that program is quite a very direct program, and a huge amount of funding is actually supporting that particular program. But just on transformation, I think one is inclined to look at the student numbers and the staff numbers, but it permeates through the entire organization. And I think that's where, in particular, where we failed.
Professor, I'm sorry to be interrupting you. I want to come to the crux of the matter with regard to transformation. Earlier we spoke about the previously disadvantaged universities, and probably in terms of dealing with transformation, we should be probably speaking about your formerly Afrikaans universities, University of the Free State, University of Potchefstroom, University of Pretoria, in a sense, was also an Afrikaans university. And there's this issue of language that many are dealing with, had various disturbances. Last week at the Pretoria University, we've had these ongoing crises at the University of Stellenbosch. I'm told this morning when I was driving in on the news that some students are parked in front of the University of Pretoria council meeting. They're waiting, there's a council meeting, they're waiting for responses regarding transformation. How do we deal with the issue of languages at our university, especially Professor Higgins? Probably you sort of touched on it in your book.
Well, I wonder if I could offer something here about the roots of student anger. And, what I see is student anger attaching to one object after another. Fees, accommodation, language, a lot of different issues.
You could actually throw in curriculum in there.
Yeah,
I could throw in curriculum, but one thing which I think hasn't been talked about, but which is clearly central, is the issue of throughput and pedagogy. As we said, there's a big increase and significant increase in the number of black students entering the university, but there's an astonishingly high figure of 55% of students not completing their first degrees. And of that 55%, 75% of those are black students. Now, I believe that a lot of anger is being generated, for sure, about the particular issues, but underlying all that is the failure of the system, or the inability of the system, to deal with the students it brings in. And this is a matter we really need to focus on. It's a core issue of the transition of students, often from black schools into white universities, or from underprivileged schools into universities. There's a big problem, as we know, with the primary and secondary education in the country. Obviously, that comes into the university. How does the university address that problem? These are the really crucial issues, I think, for universities in the state to think about. How do we keep students in? How do we make sure we can educate them? These are the things we must address.
Quickly, Professor, I just want to go back to something else. I know Professor Higgins referred to the system. In my activist here, as the system, we refer to the system as the government. Therefore, I expect the amendment bill to solve all of these things he's raising.
I don't think the bill as such and any legislation can resolve this particular matter. I just want to say a last thing about transformation, and I agree with Professor Higgins with regard to all the hard issues of throughput, of that sort of thing. But there are a number of soft issues permeating the entire organization, and you would find many of those in the institutional culture, the way in which things are being done. Those are soft issues, and much of the anger, in my view, that we currently are seeing that is raised against language actually may have its root in the institutional culture.
Professor, I wanted to start with this language issue because I asked that question when we come back from a break. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Stay with us.
We kick off this week's show by seeing how Kenyans are paying tribute to the victims, as well as not only how they've coped, but how they returned stronger after the attacks.
Last year, images of the 4-day Westgate Mall attack saturated front pages.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, artists have assembled to celebrate the peace this war-torn country has not had in a long time.
No conflict that can't be solved without a conversation.
The Journal, every Saturday at 1:30 on SABC News.
Welcome back, as we are dealing with a huge number of problems around the higher education system in our country. But Professor, if you can touch on the issues of language, how do we deal with the issues of language, especially with regard to former Afrikaans universities like the Free State, Stellenbosch and Potchefstroom?
If I could just refer to the higher education bill and what contribution that is making in this regard. It's already in the Act, and now also in the bill it is further refined. The procedure to be followed to determine the language policy of an institution and what the role of the minister would be in that regard. There's a lot of criticism about that,
yes,
but it's not changing the current situation dramatically. The point is, as far as language is concerned, I think the position by these universities was always that, it may not serve as a barrier for access and for students to benefit from the learning opportunities offered by that particular institution. Now, that's a simple statement to make. But when you go into practice, there are a number of things that would actually dirt the water around such a position. Because in some instances, it now happened that you would find that the Afrikaans class consists of white students, and the English class would consist of black students. Now, if you approach this from a learning opportunity perspective, you know, everybody will have access to those learning opportunities. But then quality issues comes into play. Then real substantive transformation comes into play. Because, and I've always, it was always my position that by allowing people to share the same space is not transformation. Transformation is much more than that.
Ask people who've been in sport. We've been fighting about this for years.
Yeah.
Professor, I read, my apologies, Professor, I want to go back to Professor Higgins. Professor Higgins, I read in your book this interview you have with the late Professor Gervo around this issue of Afrikaans and Afrikaans universities. And if you could give us a sense of how he walked around this thing in that interview.
Well, Jakes was an advocate, of course, of Afrikaans and believed that as one of the languages of the country it should be supported and educational opportunities should be made available in it. So, the question is so tricky because I think this is one of the areas which we're finding things are packed with emotion as well as with reasoning, and it's hard to disentangle the two. And I think no one has succeeded in working this out at all. So it's language is probably one of the single most emotive things because it's kind of part of your body. It's where you live for everybody in their different languages. So the problem is immense. Really
and I would want to believe, because of the advantage Afrikaans had in the old system, it is well catered for even by its community.
Yes, well, I mean, again, it's like Afrikaans has at least two sides, if you like, hasn't it? For some people, it represents apartheid itself, because it was the language of the apartheid rulers. But for other people, particularly in the Western Cape, it's the language of the local population of the Cape, of the coloured people of the Cape, and not the language of the oppressor.
Professor, I'll come back to you. I want to take this call from Danny from the Vaal. Danny, good afternoon and welcome to Rise and Recourse.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon to your guest and to all the viewers. On the question of transformation, sir, I'd like to put in a few words. Are you with me? Can I go ahead?
with you. Yes, go ahead.
I found... Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
My question is, on the question of transformation, why is it that in the engineering faculties in our universities, there are so few, very few South Africans who are lecturers and senior lecturers? Why is that? Is it because South Africans are not willing to come and work for low pay? Is it because South Africans are not interested in the education of their children? Or is it because they never thought of this as maybe a career path?
Thank you very much, Danny. That falls slam bang in the discussion about transformation. Probably, Prof. De Beer, you can answer that question, including with the issues of curriculum. What does the bill say about curriculum change? Because one of the things the students are saying, the curriculum is too abstract for them. They can't follow the curriculum. Probably it's something that has to do with what Professor Higgins raised earlier around children who are not adequately educated from township schools. You didn't put it that way, though. I know you didn't put it that way. How does the bill address that?
Yes.
Together with a question from Danny.
Yes. I think to just focus on the bill for the moment, the curriculum transformation is part of transformation in general. And what the bill is now saying is that the minister may, within the policy approved by policy consulted with the CHE, may now determine transformation goals for the system. And transformation in South Africa is not only about change, it's a contextualized concept. And we should never forget the context within which we talk about transformation. But the bill would allow now the minister, in terms of the determination of transformation goals, to also engage institutions around curriculum transformation. And now I'm sure my colleague would come, and say, and rightfully so, but now you are moving into the space of not only institutional autonomy, but academic freedom. Because you're now talking about the curriculum and what would be the powers of the minister in that regard. But sadly, in South Africa, if you understand transformation, you have to test those spaces as well.
I just want to come back to something else with regard to the issue of language. I looked at the Constitution that says everyone has a right to be taught in a language of his own, in his own language. And we have 11 official languages that are recognized by the Constitution. How do we deal with this thing? It comes to a point where I said to somebody when I was preparing for this interview, I said, obviously, it's not a discussion that can be had in an hour. It's even worse so. It's not a discussion that can be had for 2 days or 3 days in Parliament. These are discussions that should be had for the whole year or for the last 20 years. We should have been having this discussion. Why didn't we have this discussion?
Yeah, Dumile, indeed. I think the discussion should have happened all the time. My problem is...
Professor, just hold that thought, and you can come back to that thought, because as I said, it's not a discussion that can be had in an hour. If you want to join us, you can call us like Danny on 071 011 712 714 9559. I'll give you the number will be on the screen. Stay with us.
As stories are broken around the world, SABC makes sure you do not miss out. As the stories unfold throughout the day, News at 8 updates all newsworthy stories worldwide. Globally, we are there. Locally, we leave no story untold. Make a date with News at 8 every Saturday and Sunday on SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome back as we discuss the issue of the Higher Education Amendment Bill. Professor, you are still busy explaining to us. You haven't answered Danny's question too.
Yes. I just respond to Danny's question. I think it's a very good question. And it relates to the fact that we, in this particular program, like engineering, we've got a huge backlog of black students coming into the system late And now we have a number of black students in some of these programs. But the moment they qualified professionally, let me first say most of them are sponsored by companies.
Private companies.
So the moment they complete their studies, they have this obligation to return to the workplace. But apart from that, once they qualified professionally, they're so in demand that they can actually choose where they would like to go. And most of them, you know, and one should understand this, it's called black tax by students. They have, you know, they have to break the cycle of poverty at home. And those at home are actually depending on the contributions of these individuals that the whole community actually clubbed together to put through a university education. So they're under huge pressure to leave the university and to start working, both from a sponsor's perspective, but also from their personal responsibilities towards their families. And it's not that they're not interested in the education of their children.
It's not that they're not interested
want to
in getting dirty. You know,
Yeah.
everybody associates engineering with getting dirty.
Yeah.
The diesel, the petrol, and all of those, the oil, and all of those things.
Yeah, no, it's not that. It's really something else, which we should respect.
I want to come back to something else that we spoke about earlier, Professor Higgins. There's a reference in the bill that says there's also the issue of public accountability, which we spoke about earlier, because universities, by virtue of being public facilities, need to demonstrate public accountability. There was an issue that was raised at the hearings, which I saw on television by Dr. Max Price of the University of Cape Town, around this issue of accountability. Apparently, somewhere in the bill, which I did not read from page 1 to the last page, there's a reference to universities must be subject to the PFMA because they are public facilities.
The answer to that?
Yes, I think I missed the televised hearings, unfortunately, but I think what it refers to is you know, there's a general tendency that we call managerialism, which has swept the world, it's a global thing, on trying to run universities exactly like businesses. And I think that's the thinking behind, in the bill, bringing it under another administrative layer. But the sort of problem which emerges from that is not recognising the specificity of the university, which is to say that as this curious educational institution, it has very internalised rules for progression in the institution and so on. So to apply kind of a different kind of public administration thinking to it, it doesn't really work. So I think it's something like that which was the problem.
I think Professor De Beer had an answer to that.
There's a reference in the definitions of the bill to the PFMA. As the case is at the moment, the universities are not subject to the provisions of the PFMA. But with all due respect, there are many things in the regulations and the practices that you would find within the PFMA that the university can actually benefit from a administration and from a management perspective. And I think apart from that, I think one should also just allude to the regulations that were promulgated by the minister a year or so ago with regard to the reporting responsibilities of higher education institutions. If you look at that, you know, what is actually coming to the university through those regulations are good and sound management principles and practices that should actually be applied by the universities. Now, within certain environments and certain universities, that is not a challenge. But I can assure you, in others, it's a major challenge, which I think these regulations and then make the PFMA applicable in some instances would provide guidance to universities to better their management and administrative processes. And I don't think that is now to say that it should be managed without taking into account the peculiarities of a higher education institution. A university is not a business as you would find outside, although some of the business principles will definitely apply to the university.
Let me give Professor Higgins the last word, his last word from Cape Town.
Well, I think just on the institutional autonomy issue, it's very important, we get these terms, and one of the academic tasks we have is to analyse and disassemble them. And I think what's crucial here is that we think there are at least two dimensions to institutional autonomy and public accountability. One concerns the financial management of the universities, but the other concerns the internal pedagogic mission of the universities and the running and regulating of its courses. In relation to that second dimension, which is the one linked to academic freedom, that's where the bill raises some concerns of ministerial intervention into the pedagogic mission. The other dimension of institutional autonomy, which Chris has just been talking about, which is efficient and responsible running of the finances, well, yes, that does need to be carefully regulated. But I think we need to observe that one dimension of institutional autonomy is strongly tied to academic freedom.
Thank you very much,
and we
Professor.
need to
Thank
think
you very
very
much, Professor
carefully
Higgins.
about that.
Thank you very much,
you.
Professor Higgins. Professors, thank you very much for your time. I realize in the middle of the program that really all of these issues that are problematic in our education system cannot be dealt with in this program. It means we'll have to find another day to discuss academic freedom and also discuss things like autonomy and other things that we have left out of this discussion. This has been Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning. Do find us on Twitter and YouTube from all of us here in the studio and the rest of the team. Thank you to our guests and goodbye.